Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And I want to start off with the second episode where we talk about Sweden in our intro.
We love Sweden.
Well, here's what's funny. So we've talked about Sweden before because there was a period where Sweden suddenly out of nowhere became our number 2 country of listeners. And
Yes.
they eclipsed Canada and UK, which at the time were our only other countries where we had people. So this is very early on in the beginning. So we were super excited about that. But Sweden has stayed reliably in our top 3 or 4. And in fact, I just checked. Currently, they are number 4, just behind, of course, the US, which is by far our largest country of listenership. But currently, Canada and Australia, who is a new runner in that Australia has not previously been in our top.
Well,
3 or 4,
I'm sure it's just because of the delay. You know, getting
oh my God.
all the way.
Is that a dad joke?
I'm not going to
Tom,
pull
please
my
back up and edit
technological
that.
savvy here, but I'm fairly sure I'm on solid ground technologically here. That it takes a long time for our podcast to get there.
It's going to take everything I have not to ask Tom to edit out that groaner of a joke. All right. So more importantly, though, than Sweden being a top listenership country for us, as you know, we've mentioned a few times that we now have this Facebook group that we're using instead of the Facebook page, instead of a lot of the other places we were trying out some social media. This is the place where we are kind of sticking our flag in the dirt, staking our claim here in this Facebook group, which is where we're going to post lots of extra stuff. It's where we'll be chatting 24/7 randomly. And we've had, a couple weeks ago, we had someone join from Utah, which was very exciting. But on Sunday, we had someone join from Sweden.
Yes, we did.
And I was irrationally happy about it. Like it truly made my day. So, and I, if I botch your name, I apologize. But Nils Ingvall.
Welcome, Nils.
Welcome, Nils. It was really, really, you really made my day when I saw your name come through. So, hop into our international conversation on Real Honest Business. You can find us on Facebook at. You can actually search for the SHMS podcast community. You can also just go to the So Here's My Story Facebook page, and right under the main picture, there's a link that says visit the group. That's probably the easiest way to get there right now. We are rolling out a new website within the next week or 2, and there'll be some very easy links there to get to it, as well as some other things. But that's my most exciting news was, Nils, if it makes your day, maybe that you were my best news this week so far.
Absolutely.
But you have a very exciting week.
I do. I have a great week, a great tomorrow, actually, where my family and I are going up to New York because my little background, my youngest just turned 15. And so several years ago, as a concerned father, I was grilling him on what his playlist was because while I didn't hope to understand most of it, there are certain things that I view as inappropriate. And I just wanted to find out what he was listening to. And so he said, "You want to see my Spotify list?" And I said, "Yeah, I do. I want to see it." So he turned it around and it was Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong. He just loves this stuff. So anyway.
I love that.
Flash forward about 6 months later, and he comes down the stairs and he's singing a Billy Joel song. And I was, "Well, how do you know that?" And he said, "No, I really love Billy Joel." And he was explaining that he stumbled over Billy Joel and he's been really kind of binging on Billy Joel. So that was in November. His birthday was at the end of January. But in November, my wife and I decided we'd get him a birthday present, and that would be tickets to Billy Joel at Madison Square Garden.
Oh.
And so we are going tomorrow.
That's exciting.
And I am super excited. I've never been to a concert in Madison Square Garden. Yeah. And it's great when your kid loves something you love too. It's like a present for you. So yeah, it's really interesting. I think for our sample size of 2, this is statistically completely irrelevant, but I also have a 15-year-old son. And he is also really into older music, both really old music as well as, which I guess technically qualifies as really old, as I was going to say, it's like the 80s, 70s and 80s. He's really into like Earth, Wind and Fire and a bunch of 80s stuff. And it's just really, really interesting. He's not too much into like modern
modern
and
stuff. So I don't. Maybe it's like a generational.
Well, from
thing.
that we can draw the statistically valid conclusion that
let's name their generation and start writing LinkedIn posts about how they only like this kind of music.
All 15-year-olds only like that. Yes.
Which reminds me of two things. One, at some point I want to do an episode on absolutism, such as all and never, and you always and you sometimes, you never. But you mentioned Spotify.
I did.
That's our other big news this week is we are now listed on Spotify. You can find us on Spotify. You can follow us on Spotify. And the reason that is an extra exciting thing is that Spotify isn't wide open to anybody listening. They do actually have some standards.
I love how you say that. We exceeded some standards.
I'm not going to pretend like, it's like, getting into an Ivy League college or something. I mean, it's not like they hold the bar that high, but they don't just accept any old podcast. There is a review process.
Well, the way you say it,
whatever their standards are.
How David Letterman describes his alma mater. David Letterman went to Ball State University, which he describes as the Harvard of Muncie.
Oh, man. Oh, if only you knew how much that is funny for my family. But anyway, that's a whole nother story for another day. Okay, so let's move on. Do you want to thank our sponsors?
I do. I'd like to thank Tom Loveland of Mind Over Machines, Cat's Copy, the architecture firm of GWWO, and Mary Craft, Staffing and HR Solutions.
So before we move on, I will just mention that the reason I was laughing is that the president of GWWO Architects went to Ball State. So
Harvard of Muncie.
But I don't believe that he's a listener, so I think that's okay. All right.
I have a story.
Okay.
So I'm going to go with that. I think that in our last episode, you just decided that it was your turn. So I'm going to seize the opportunity. Yes. And it's
Carpe story. How does that work?
Carpe story.
Whatever. Go ahead.
Carpe recording.
I can tell we're going to have a very focused day.
Yes, we are. Okay. And actually, this is a focused story. So, all right. So here's my story. Over the weekend, I sent an email to an engineering firm for which I had just done a pretty involved workshop. And my email was intended to convey the thought that I thought my workshop failed. And here's why. This firm is a national firm, and it flew in project managers and supervisors and vice presidents from all over the country. And they asked me to give a 90-minute presentation on their contracts. They were concerned that their project managers didn't understand their contracts. And more importantly, their project managers, if they didn't understand the contracts, that couldn't get through the dense legalese, they wouldn't be able to discuss concerns with their counterparts before it went to legal.
Right.
So they asked me to come in and explain the contracts, what indemnification meant, where the tips, tricks, and traps are in warranties and things. And they sent me a number of their contracts for me to take apart. So I was speaking the same language, and I did that. And I did everything that they wanted me to do. And believe it or not, I actually figured out ways to keep people's attention for 90 minutes wading through the thicket of legalese.
Sounds thrilling.
And
did it involve cattle prods?
It involved, well, I won't go into that, but it went well, and the organizers of this workshop were very enthusiastic. It was well received. The attendees were happy with it. The organizers said they couldn't have asked for a better presentation. And yet, over the weekend, which was several days after the presentation, I told them, I went into great detail as to why the workshop failed. And here's why. I was thinking about DARE, D-A-R-E, which is drug abuse resistance education. Parents and kids generally know about it. It's where police officers come into schools and they talk about the hazards of drugs and the drug lifestyle. And it's in thousands of school districts. It is the most popular drug resistance outreach program in the country. And the studies have shown it to be ultimately ineffective. What that means is that people who attend DARE, students who attend DARE, are just as likely to abuse drugs as students who did not attend DARE. And so if you go further in other analyses, not just of DARE, but of other workshops, The conclusion, and I've seen a number of these, and the most recent writing I've seen of this was in Chip and Dan Heath's book, The Power of Moments. The conclusion is that, generally speaking, people know the right thing to do. This is particularly apt for drug abuse education. People know the right thing to do. What they need practice on is how to do it. Mm-hmm. So they really would benefit from, although it sounds trite, but well-conceived role-playing of, you're in this situation, you've got to resist peer pressure, this is what's happening. You're not dealing with a clean slate because you've practiced this conversation. You know what you want to say. You know your comebacks, or you know how to beg off of whatever's being offered without sounding lame or uncool or whatever it is. And so DARE, much like my workshop, has featured just talking to and educating people. So I could educate people on the legalese, but what the organizers really needed to accomplish their purposes, they needed their project managers and VPs to feel comfortable and on solid ground, solid footing, having practiced the conversations with their counterparts on how to broach these subjects, how to deal with resistance, how to get past the, let's just send it to legal.
And it doesn't mean that the knowledge isn't important, because in part of the confidence, part of what's challenging about those conversations is, even like, there are times where I get a little bit like, my spidey sense goes off about something, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's not the way that should be. But if I don't have if I'm not, I have some knowledge, it depends on how strongly that gut sense is about whether I'll speak to it. Whereas if someone has said, no, that's not okay, I'm more likely to be like, all right, look, this doesn't seem right, whether it's a contract or whatever. So the knowledge piece is important.
The knowledge is important,
but it's not enough.
It doesn't get you there. And so when I think about why most, and we joke about this all the time, why most personnel evaluations fail, or why most managers are ineffective dealing with their teams, et cetera. It's part of it is just, I think a lot of it is that they, if anything, they're given the knowledge of this is what we expect, but they're not made comfortable in the art of the conversation, of conveying enough of having that communication so that what they want to accomplish is accomplished.
Yeah, no, I can think of 20 things I'd love to point out for this, but interestingly,
I didn't think I'd stump you on that one. I figured you'd have a lot to say.
Yeah. So this is yet another time that I wish Christy Schmier, who is on the team, does our show notes, was part of this conversation, because sort of another it's not even a metaphor. It's just another instance of this thing you're talking about. And then I have another directly business story about it. So Christy does some of the most brilliant, useful, actual, actionable health and nutrition coaching and guidance of anyone I know.
Right.
And this is in part why. First of all, she's super practical. So, she's not someone who's like, don't ever have this and don't ever have that. She's like, look, let's figure out what works for you. But one of the things that she has people do in the Facebook group that she has, Health U, that's health with just the letter U, is she'll say, let's make a plan for your worst day. Like, what if you didn't meal prep, you didn't pack your lunch, you don't have it, what does your worst case scenario look like? And what are some options that are, let's think through putting into practice the art of, because sure, it's great if you spend your entire Sunday meal prepping and you have it all packaged up and ready to
wonderful
go. It's great. And when I do that, I stay right on course.
But it's not every day.
But no, I go away for the weekend and I get home at 7:00 on Sunday. And often that means my entire week is off the rails because I never got it set up. Well, she talks about that. And it's really interesting because I'm sure she's noticed this, but when she asked that question, it's actually hard to get people to answer that question. They'll say, well, I just need to prep. And she's like, yeah, I know. But on your worst day, what's the plan for when it doesn't go the way you thought it would? Which is the piece that, because even if somebody walked out of it's almost like sort of the step after the step that you're talking about. Even if somebody walked out of your seminar, had the knowledge to feel confident enough to say, this indemnification clause isn't good or bad or whatever. It doesn't work for us. Here's our problem. Yeah. If the other person doesn't go, oh, okay, great, and they have to continue that conversation, they're probably a little bit stumped. I mean, they may have one or two steps, but they haven't really practiced all the ways that conversation might go, or even some of the ways that conversation might go, to sort of practice those alternative paths. So I think that's really fascinating. And where I see this a lot in business. It's why I've almost become almost skeptical about the possibility of culture projects. Not quite, because I still believe in I hold culture to be one of the most important, like a three-legged stool of what makes for a good business. But it's just so hard to work on culture in the wrong way. And so easy to work on it in the wrong way is what I meant to say. It's easy to work on it in the wrong way. And it normally looks like this, like, let's have a workshop on what our culture should be like, or how we should
talk about our best day,
or even not culture. Like, let's do a leader. I get really, really hung up and a little ranty. Actually, you and I had a conversation with a friend about this, about doing, wanting to do leadership training, and, a company to come in and do these, like a workshop or even a series of workshops where they're talking about leadership-ish things and how to be leadership-y and how to be a good leader, and
leadership-ish and leadership-y.
Exactly. Stick those in the glossary. And all those things make perfect sense. And this goes back to a really fascinating article called The Neuroscience of Leadership, where they go into great detail about how if you are told something, even if you're shaking your head going, oh my God, that's amazing. That's fantastic. I so agree with it. Your brain is still relatively in a dormant state, for lack of, oversimplifying here by far. But if you can guide someone to I think they call it a self-discovered realization or something, whether that's through questions or through practice, where their brain has to sort of search around and find their own way in it somehow. I've literally watched the fMRIs or the PET scans, I can't remember which one, where you see like the neurons fire and synapses do their thing.
The thing is that the two areas of the brain involved in expressing language and interpreting language are Broca's area and Wernicke's area, and that really comes to about 7% of the brain mass. But when you look at the areas of the brain that are involved in a story or in practice where it's engaged, you can see the neurons light up. So what the statistics of the last study that I read, and unfortunately I can't quote the study, but the statistics were that if you're just being explained something 10 minutes after that presentation, no matter how intriguing it is, you retain about 10%. Oh, wow. But if you're involved in it, if there's a story and you feel yourself physically as part of the story, let alone interacting in a workshop, that 10% goes up to 65%. Huh. So it's a startling difference, not just a statistically kind of significant thing.
And almost as startling, how have I known you as long as I've known you and not realized that you were a brain geek too?
I love that stuff.
I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but I don't think I've never explicitly heard this stuff come out of your mouth. So I was like, oh my God, that's interesting. I love that. All right. No, I think this is really important. It shows up in so many different ways. I mean, you can take this down to a really mundane level of a Monday meeting of a team, like, okay, guys, we got to really go do this thing and blah, blah, and everyone sort of shakes their head and then walks out. Actually, let me back up for a second. I often see this issue that happens where, and this is especially true in smaller companies or smaller divisions or teams, where there's someone leading that and they, in their own brain, on their own time, go through this probably pretty long and involved mental process to come to a conclusion. And
there's someone leading what? Are you leading?
A team or a company or whatever it is, just situations where, I mean, it probably doesn't even have to just be for small. So I'll ramble through it for a second, see if you can figure out where I'm going here. I see this thing happen a lot where a person, or sometimes just a couple people, like 2 or 3 people, stumble their way through a complex issue to get to a conclusion that's actually really well thought out and has considered a lot of different variables and has run down hallways and realized that there's no door down there, even though it seemed like a great hallway, and they come back and they reconfigure and they get to a point and it really does make a lot of sense. And then they want to go just like tell everyone on the team or in the company about their conclusion, and expect them to just pick up right where their brain is leaving off and run with it. And they're frustrated when I suggest that they need to find ways to involve people along the way, or even find ways to help walk them through. Now, what's probably not going to work is to say like, okay, we're going to walk you through the last 3 months and how we got here, because that's still just telling.
But the journey is important.
The journey is important. So sometimes even just doing that can help, even to just sort of say, like, we did think of this and we did think of this and here's why that didn't work. But even better is finding ways to involve people along the way, if even remote. And people are, I gotta say, a lot of folks are terrified of that because it seems like, oh, we don't want to ask them because then they'll have ideas and we'll have to include them. Well, guess what? Not including their thought processes and then just trying to
doesn't preclude their ideas.
It doesn't preclude their ideas, and it doesn't preclude them from sticking an oar in the water if they think you didn't think about the things that they can see. So it's, I totally acknowledge that with everything everyone has on their plate, adding in, trying to weave in other people into a thought process is challenging, because here's the other reason it's so important. If you are the leader of something and you find yourself frustrated that your people can't think like you do or think through things as thoroughly, and it's because they don't have line of sight to what you think about. You have to be able to, I think of it almost as like slowing down and stretch, like playing your mental video in slow-mo for them so they can see all the things you're thinking about. And then they'll start to be able to see some of those things. And then you also see the things they see that you don't. So
right. And I think they have to buy in. So they do have to take part of that journey with you, because their journey of discovery is important on that facet. On the other part of it, in my workshop or in DARE, what was important to the company or important to the school districts for DARE is not what was happening in the workshop. What was important to them is what happens after the workshop. So they envision, this company that I did the workshop with, they envision their project managers being able to have these crucial conversations on contractual issues with their counterpart. DARE, you envision the students being able to face these situations of adversity and having conversations with peers or with people who would pressure them into making bad decisions. And so nothing in the experience of the workshops prepares people to see the next actions as common ground, as practiced ground, as familiar ground. Mm-hmm. So they just didn't walk through it. And it's just like presenting people with the conclusion that you reached after going down all of those doorless hallways.
Mm-hmm. So here's really funny, because I bet you no one will balk at the statement you made. You have to get their buy-in. I think the perception of what buy-in means is wildly off base many, many, many times, because I think people think of buy-in as, well, I'll tell it to them in a way that they'll agree it's a good idea and they won't be angry about it, or they won't argue with it, and they'll walk out in agreement. That's not buy-in.
No.
Like what you're trying to, and it's funny that the word familiar is so important. I think of it as, in as much as you set up the territory where your people have to come ask you, like if you haven't installed what I think of as like an internal GPS for them, so they understand the guidance system that is guiding a project. If you haven't woven them in enough that they can develop their own internal guidance system, then they have to keep coming to you to say, like, is this the right way or is that the right? Because they don't know. And the same with your workshop. Like you kind of gave them a vague idea of like, we're heading west, but they don't have enough of an internal GPS. Like at some point they have to know, well, are we headed to Seattle or San Diego? Because that needs a different, west
and
doesn't
so
quite
it's
work.
Not buy-in. You're right. Because a lot of times buy-in is just, they buy what I'm selling. They agree.
Right.
They agree that these are risks. They didn't fight me, and they get that and they're nodding along. But they didn't take it and annex it as their own. They didn't just put it inside and say, this is mine now.
Yeah.
And that's where the difference is.
And I will say, I think that is an impossibly high bar. I mean, just because I always think when we do these podcasts of like, okay, so what do I do with that? That's part of the problem. You can't do a workshop in 90 minutes where somebody walks out with a familiarization that they can do. But that's okay as long as that is acknowledged. Like, okay, now you know this much. Now you know when to like have a quick call with Elliot, or here's what you do to develop that next step. Like you could create more of that internalization probably in your 90 minutes maybe than you did.
Well, yes, but the thing is that there has to be an alignment between what the organizers, what the team leaders, what the CEO wants the attendees to be able to do afterwards and what can actually be accomplished. Yeah. So if they said,
which is tricky,
we just want them to understand the legalese, then this 90 minutes worked very well.
Yeah.
Now, they're not saying they memorized everything, but it certainly acquainted them with it and it worked very well. But if they said, now we want them to be able to hold these conversations with their counterparts, then there was a misalignment of what was possible within those 90 minutes with what their expectations were. And that's because of the quote buy-in or the workshop-y part of it.
Yeah. I think that familiarization part of it feels so important. Like you have to be able to find your own kind of dance steps in it almost and sometimes I think that can come with practice, which can feel, I gotta say, it can feel so hokey in a workshop. Like
it can. And it always makes me cringe when I see that. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's exactly the example of even just setting the stage for, I mean, sometimes I'll say whenever I do some kind of like leadership, like a shorter term leadership engagement. And I'll be honest, I always question whether or not to do them because internally I worry that they're a waste of time. But I usually go back to saying, well, I think of it as planting seeds and what seeds do I want to plant in hopes that the ones that take root, there'll be opportunities, whether it's through me or whether other things they go look for, they can start to see things differently. So I will sometimes just even be predictive about those things. Like, because actually, I've even used this example. My mom took a self-defense class when I was like a teenager. It was like a 6-week kind of self-defense, whatever, thing. And at the end of it, the guy said, congratulations, you now know exactly enough to really get yourself hurt. Because now you think you know something, so you might walk down that alley that you wouldn't have walked down before, right. Or you might walk to your car at night, in that not so great place. And by saying that, it actually preempted that at least a little bit to say like, okay, yeah, you know something, but you don't know enough to go like running headfirst into battle. This is a defensive if you need it, but it's that kind of thing of like, yeah, you know a lot, but this is, I think even that predictive of it, it's still going to be like, it's the implementation, the practice of how you do it. But I think that's the case with everything is, it's not unlike our little conversation this morning. We have all these ideas, but then you actually have to like go do them. It's like, there's bits of knowledge and then there's the rollout practice of actually putting them into place.
Right. And I think that so much of it has to do with understanding that after 6 weeks, your mom knew enough to really get herself hurt. She had she knew enough to repel an attack that started with a right hand punch to the chest after a 3-second delay. But not everything goes that way.
Right.
But yeah, so that's what struck me was I guess where I'm coming from is the misalignment of expectation with reality and the importance of not just knowing the right thing to do, but really diving deep on equipping people on creating familiar ground out of how to do it. So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
You
can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best
Lovingly
of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which
is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.